Leading industry chambers are demanding that unless the Reserve Bank of India prints lots and lots of money, the economy won't recover quickly. It's funny because just 4 or 5 months back, in February this year, these were industrialists and lobbies were so upbeat about the union budget's announcements for the economic recovery that they'd called it a truly transformative one. They were even comparing it to the 1991 budget. The lesson, I guess, for us is that we are being sold something all the time. It takes an expert to explain if it's likely to be a gift or a nightmare. The economy is in a difficult phase and the GDP today is smaller than it was last year. A large number of Indians are earning less. The RBI is in no such trouble clearly. Judging by the record dividend it has paid to the government, the RBI is making lots and lots of money. When the RBI makes money, who really foots the bill? My guest today is Professor Gurbachan Singh. I asked him about the demands that the RBI print more and more money so that the government can spend it for reviving the economy and easing people's economic hardships. This is a very technical subject that becomes very difficult sometimes for people with no background to grasp why what the RBI is up to is very, very different from what central banks in the United States and Japan have been doing. But Professor Singh explained it all so simply that this is easily one of the best episodes of the Everyday Economics podcast that provides answers to questions lay listeners often ask, as well as engages with the debates technical experts and economists are divided on. Good morning, Professor Singh. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be holding this session with you.
Economists understand that there are certain limits on the amount of money that the RBI or any central bank in any country can print and create. When economists put forward these arguments, two kinds of responses come in response to economists. One tends to be that all of these things, these rules and theories have been created in other countries, in Western countries, and they don't apply to India. Or two, now increasingly it is said that even Western central banks in Western economies, such as the US Federal Reserve, is doing exactly this. So if you could, just help clear some of these doubts that people tend to have.
Gladly. So actually, I think the background for the views that you are talking about lies in what has happened in the US, Europe, Japan. So let me spend a minute on that background, because otherwise, my argument will not be convincing in what I have to say later. So what the people are familiar with is the case in the US, Europe, and Japan, where the base money, which is the central bank money, which has expanded massively, and there has been little inflation over the period of some 12, 13, 14, 15 years since 2007. Now, it's only in 2021 that the situation has changed in the US. The inflation rate has jumped, and that is a very, very recent phenomenon. And that too has happened only in the US. It has not happened in Europe. It has not happened in Japan. So the first thing to understand is why, despite the expansion of base money there was no inflation. And having said that, having explained that, then we can come to why the situation is different in India. So first things first. So in the US, not many people realize that what is happening is that post 2007, the rate of growth of real investment, the rate of growth of GDP has been less compared to the pre-2007 period. That is a basic premise with which we must start. Now, it is that lower investment which is actually responsible for the low rate of interest. And I want to emphasize that because people link low rate of interest to the massive expansion of liquidity. There may be some connection, there is some connection, but that is not the primary thing. Now, so I want to separate the low rate of interest from the expansion of base money. Now, what does this expansion of base money mean? And it is related to what I was saying earlier, which is that when the rate of the growth of real investment is low, That is also related to the growth of bank credit being low. Now, in the US, they call them depository institutions because you have banks and other kinds of institutions. But to keep the terminology simpler and familiar, let us call them banks only. So the banks in the US are not lending at a rate that they used to previously. So what do they do with the money? They would like to keep the money with the Federal Reserve. They invest to some extent in government securities, but not all the way in government securities because there is an interest rate risk. The interest rates are low, they have been low, and there is a fear that it would rise. If it rises, the prices of these government bonds will fall, the banks will incur a loss. So instead of parking their money in government securities beyond a point, I'm not saying they don't do it, but they won't do it all the way there. What do? They keep the money with the Fed. You don't have an interest rate risk there because it's a cash deposit, it's a reserve. And you also get some interest. It's safe, unlike government bonds, meaning the interest rate risk. I'm not saying there's a default risk, though that could be a separate story, but let us not get there. So now what is happening is that the money is going from the banks to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve in turn is giving the money to the government. Okay. So in this whole process, what is happening is that the Federal Reserve is acting as a financial intermediary between the banks and the government. Now, we know from financial economics. So here, by the way, the argument that I have made is an argument of financial economics. It's not an argument of monetary economics. Now, when you do financial economics, financial intermediation cannot lead to inflation. There is no such theory which says that financial intermediation leads to inflation. So now the so-called expansion of base money, I should say so-called, it is actually expansion. But what I had in mind was that the definitions of base money are such that even the expansion of the role of financial intermediation on the part of the Federal Reserve shows up as a jump in the base money. And actually, many people are arguing in India in favor of expansion of central bank money on the basis of what they've heard about the US, Europe, Japan.
Yes.
So they say, well, there has not been inflation there. Why are you worried about inflation? So that is not a concern. And it has not happened in 1 year, it has not happened over more than a decade. So this whole fear is without any basis. So I just want to clarify the nature of the expansion of base money in the US. So it is a case of financial intermediation. Financial intermediation does not lead to inflation, which is why US, Europe, Japan have not had inflation despite the massive jump in the base money. We can come to India now. Now in India, that is not the story. So one way to explain this is that, as you would know, there has been a high rate of growth of currency in India in 2020 and even subsequently, I think, though I'm not very up to date with the data, but I think that thing has gone up, currency has gone up. Now, currency has gone up, meaning it has gone above its usual growth path. If you see the US experience from 2007 till the early part of 2020 at least, the currency did not move above its previous growth path. So when people say the Fed has printed money, they have in mind that these currency notes are being printed. That is not the case at all, barring the very recent time, which is a different story, and where you also see some inflation. So in India, firstly, the currency has gone up substantially, and that one can link with inflation. Second, the major part of the expansion, and related to the first point, the major part of the expansion of the base money in the US is the reserve money, which is the money that the commercial banks have with the Fed. In India, the major part of the increase in base money is not due to the commercial banks having kept with the RBI. So this is not to say that the story of the Fed being financial intermediary between banks and government does not apply here at all. Even here it does, because there are banks which are parking their money with the RBI, and the RBI is investing in government bonds or forex reserves actually. That is the other difference between the US case and India. So that part of the story is what we have here as well, but to a much smaller extent. So here the story is the more traditional story of expansion of base money, which is primarily an expansion of base money on the liability side of the currency, on the liability side of the balance sheet of the RBI, and on the asset side, actually it is more of forex reserves, not so much the government bonds. So
what you're saying is that the RBI is printing more money.
it's actually literally printing money, yes, which is not what the US Fed has done over 15 years, which is not what the Bank of Japan or the ECB have done. I may need to qualify here and there in the case of Japan or ECB, but broadly that story applies to them as well. But definitely the US, the data is very unambiguous on that. So they haven't printed currency, we have printed currency. They have not had inflation for more than a decade. We had it as soon as we had this currency printing. The inflation rate, I saw the World Bank data, it puts it at 6.6% for 2020. It was not clear whether it was the calendar year or the fiscal year, but it was 6.6% figure which is mentioned. Now, as I mentioned,
I read somewhere that the RBI has in the last 18 months expanded its balance sheet by 50%.
I am not sure about that, but that could be, but I'm not sure. One has, even if it is an expansion of 50%, one has to read the items more carefully.
The breakup of.
But the breakup, that does seem a large figure to me, but you may be right. You would know this. But in any case, the point is that in India one can relate inflation to the base money. So that is where the story is different in India compared to the story in the US.
And simply to take just one step back and say, how is it that what happens when the Reserve Bank just decides to print money? How does that generate income? You've written about how the dividend that the RBI is paying to the government of India is actually really an inflation tax. It's not just money getting created out of thin air, or it is not just paper, but it is actually tax that is getting collected from a certain category of the Indian population. So if you could explain that for people who don't know this.
Sure. So if I may need to get a little more technical. I couldn't do that in the column. It was a short column, and that too for a general audience. So the inflation tax is actually looked at in two ways. One is the sense in which I use the term in my column, which is that the people are being taxed, their purchasing power falls just as in the case of any other tax. The other and possibly more traditional way of looking at inflation tax is that there is this outside money, as we call it. There is inside money and outside money. Outside money is what is the asset of the public and liability of the public authorities. Now, that outside money is primarily currency. So what is happening is that when you issue too much currency, it leads to inflation. It leads to a decrease in the real value of the currency being held by the public. So by that definition of inflation tax, what is happening is that the tax is taking the form of the depletion of the real value of the currency held by the public. Okay. Now, that is also a deadweight loss, something I didn't mention. It's related to the idea of a tax, which is that it is not just a transfer from the public to the government. It is also a deadweight loss in the sense that the economy as a whole, the society as a whole, loses. So there is an aggregate loss besides the distribution from the public to the government. Now, alongside this distribution from the public to the government, there is also a redistribution within the public. So, which is that the people who are less well off, less well informed, people who have low bargaining power, they tend to lose out more when there is an inflation process. Now, I'm going beyond this idea of depletion of real value of currency notes. You know, if your wage income doesn't keep pace with inflation, then you are losing and somebody else is gaining. Okay, so there is an aggregate transfer from the public to the government, and then within the public there is this redistribution happening. So the less well off, the less well informed, and people with low bargaining power tend to lose more. So by that original textbook definition of inflation tax as a depletion of the real purchasing power, that is the aggregate. But some people lose more than that, some people lose less than that. So, which is where I was saying, I was talking about, you know, the net overall result, which is that there are the disproportionate effect is on these people. Now, so actually coming back more specifically to your question now. So, when the RBI prints notes, the paper on which it prints, the printing cost is negligible, treated as zero for all practical purposes. So that is, you have a cost of zero, and let's say you are talking about a 500 rupee note being printed. So it has 500 rupee note value. It's a legal tender. So the RBI can have purchasing power. Now the RBI itself does not buy, but what it does is that it prints the notes and acquires government bonds or forex reserves. Let me simplify and take the case of government bonds, because forex reserves will then lead us to the issues of open economy. So what is happening is RBI prints money, it buys government bond, the government acquires that money. Now on the face of it, the government of India has borrowed when it issues. But you know, you are issuing a bond to another public sector undertaking, it's all within home. You know, ghar ki baat hai. So it stays there. So the government of India then buys something. So it gets purchasing power. It can buy goods. Now, in the whole process, now this is standard textbook economics. In this whole process, the production of goods and services has not increased. So if government gets the purchasing power, somebody else loses that purchasing power. And the loss of the purchasing power is the part that I was talking about earlier. So that is where it is an inflation tax. Now, coming to the accounting side to complete the argument. So on the accounting side, as far as the RBI is concerned, it does not pay interest on the currency notes, but it gets interest on government bonds. So it has massive income every year. But the root of that income is printing, inflation tax, and so on. So when you show in your accounts an income of a corporation, I mean RBI is actually nothing but a corporation. It's a public sector undertaking. So it shows up as profit. Okay, they may be using some other term, but that is what it amounts to. But in any case, out of the profits, you pay the shareholder. The shareholder is the government. So you pay a dividend. So there is a facade of a dividend income from the RBI to the government. It is as if it's the same as dividend income from Punjab National Bank or from State Bank of India or from some oil marketing company. But the nature of that dividend income is very different from this so-called dividend income, right? So we've seen earlier that this is actually inflation tax. But the accounting in the Government of India shows it as a dividend income. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I hope if anybody in government is listening to this conversation, they'll realize that what they think is just dividend coming to them is actually not dividend and is actually creating problems for their long term goals of more equity and taking care of people's income growth, etc.
So
So you.
just sorry to interrupt, but on that, let me just add. So the problem with inflation tax, as I mentioned in that column also, it is a regressive tax. It was implicit in what I was saying earlier, but let me make it explicit. This is unlike income tax. Income tax is a progressive tax. The bulk of the population is exempt by law. Inflation tax, it is that bulk of the population which is not exempt. In fact, they bear the much of the.
Burden of.
So, we worry about indirect taxes being high. We say direct taxes should be higher. But here you have an even more serious problem, because even within indirect taxes, at least you have this notion that a low tax rate for a necessity, a high tax rate for a luxury. To some extent, it takes care of this notion of indirect tax being a regressive tax. But inflation tax is far more deadly. And when we moved to inflation targeting, we said let's have 4% inflation target. So the idea was that, so let me also clarify. The way I have gone about it so far, it's as if inflation has only costs. Now inflation also has benefits. So you do a cost benefit analysis and then you arrive at what is an optimal rate for a particular country. In India, it's supposed to be 4%. In the US, it's supposed to be 2%. Now, it was 3 years of deliberations after which it was agreed that it should be 4%. And then in March of this year, it was agreed to renew it for a period of another 5 years with the same inflation target of 4%. Now, if that is the target, then it is not good that for an entire year the RBI was way above that target. It is actually 65% higher. And I was surprised at the calculation myself. 6.6 over 4, when you work it out, it is 65% higher. And which means that it is falling on the bulk of the population. Sorry, you were saying something. And
Yeah, what I was saying is related to exactly what you've just said, and which is that there are two things. Although we seem to have reached consensus that inflation targeting was the way forward for the Reserve Bank's monetary policy approach, yet I find a lot of economists, and now I'm talking about technical experts, not just lay people. A lot of economists come back and say, well, but in a country like India, the Reserve Bank can do nothing about prices of onions, and inflation targeting is not for a informal economy like dominant informal economy like India. And the second thing that people say is that how do we know? In fact, this is the Reserve Bank itself which has been saying that in the current economic situation, they have to make growth their priority, and this inflation that is being seen is not a monetary phenomenon. It is because of supply side disruptions. So if you could clarify these 2 points. These are both coming from technical experts. Now we are no longer.
Yes. So firstly, the data. Now, as I said earlier, we have data on currency expansion and we have data on inflation. So it is a monetary phenomenon. The second thing is, what about supply disruptions? Now, that is not my area, but what I did was to check with Professor Bharat Ramaswamy at Ashoka University. He is an agricultural economist, a respected agricultural economist. He's been in the field for a very long time. And I wanted to know why these prices are rising. And when he looked at the supply side, he couldn't put his finger on anything which could be explaining such high inflation for such a long period. So on one hand, that was what was being shown in the data. On the other hand, it is the base money expansion which is showing up on the data. So we do have a monetary phenomenon in India. Now, the other part, it is true the RBI cannot do anything about oil price, the food price. Now, it is because it cannot do much about these, and these are important, that a leeway of 2 percentage points was allowed. By the way, a leeway of 2 percentage points is 50% flexibility. 4 to 6 is 50%. 4 minus 2 equal to 2, that is 50%. That is huge flexibility. And in the deliberations from 2013 to 16, people realized that, this is India, the situation here is different. So we need to have that leeway. Now, once you have that leeway and you go beyond 4%, then you go beyond 6%, and then you say, this is India. We haven't forgotten it is India. We knew it all along. So, and correlating it with the data on currency and base money. In fact, you're providing even stronger evidence. You're saying base money, that central bank RBI balance sheet expanded by 50%. So that now you would know your facts. Now that would strengthen my point even more. Okay. Now there's another thing that I want to add. But having said all that, I actually am in considerable sympathy with the people who talk about oil price, food price, etc. affecting inflation. Now they do have a very, very strong point that in a country like India, you have to be very careful. Having said what I had to say, let me add now a little bit more. And I know where they're coming from. And my point here is that when you have this oil price going up so much and coming down so much, it is causing so much effect on the CPI, consumer price inflation. What we need to do alongside the RBI policy is to have an appropriate fiscal policy. Now, I'm not talking about Keynesian fiscal policy. I'm just talking about the tax rate on oil. When the international price of oil is high, you lower the tax rate domestically. When the international price of oil is low, you raise the tax rate in. Okay, what that does is that it provides a cushion. We don't need to abandon inflation targeting. We just need to correct the tax rate on oil. What has been the policy in practice? Opposite. Oil price is rising, the government of India is raising its taxes. So you have a huge high oil price, and now that is coming in the way of our being able to stick to 4% inflation targeting. And what is being blamed? Inflation targeting. Now I know that the original report of the RBI did not talk about this, and that was a lacuna. That was something missing. So way back in 2014, when this was being prepared, I wrote a piece for Ideas for India, where I suggested that alongside inflation targeting by the RBI, there is a need for a policy of variation of tax rates on oil by the government of India, so that you can have inflation targeting and avoid these large fluctuations in the CPI. In fact, that could even help you reduce the leeway around 4%. Now, when you talk about reducing the leeway, a lot of people jump. They say, how can you reduce that flexibility? This is not US, this is India. It is India, but in fact, all the more the reason, because we are India, we should be varying our tax rates on oil. If they don't, they are not affected too much by oil price, food price. Now, extend that argument from not just oil, but to also things like food. So at times when the food prices are high, so there could be a lowering of the tax rates. Now I know it involves GST, but the GST law could include a clause where it says that food is such an important commodity. We're going to vary the GST rates depending on what the market situation is. That is one. The other part is that we really don't have much of free trade in agricultural goods. Every time the onion prices go up, I check with my friends abroad and I try to look up the data on onion prices in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Pakistan and Thailand. The onion price is going up only in India. Now, in a so-called open economy, this is very unfortunate, which just means that there is a domestic issue. It may be domestic production fall or it may be hoarding, whatever it is. By the way, the hoarding also gets related to a shortfall in production. It's not out of the blue. Nobody hoards in times of plenty. So whatever it is. So all it means is having a little more free trade so that when onion prices are high, onions can come in, people can import. Now again, this is not my area, but the little that I know, my understanding is that there are these curbs imports on exports, and also the trading is not completely market based, private sector based. So there are delays in decisions. Onion prices go up very high, then you read an announcement that the government of India has allowed. So we have here man-made problems, and we are not dealing with those man-made problems. We are blaming inflation target.
Yeah, what you're saying is that there are a lot of rigidities in a lot of these commodities and in the markets for these for oil, for food prices, especially onions, etc., which create problems related to inflation, and then inflation targeting gets blamed for it, and that's, I think, probably valid criticism. Couple of press conferences back of the RBI after the monetary policy review, the RBI had said that this is the first time in the history of the RBI that they are devoting their balance sheet to monetary policy and conduct of monetary policy. And this was in response to questions from journalists with regard to their borrowing program for the government that they were expanding. They've now announced a bigger program for that. And I was discussing this with somebody who has been in the finance ministry for many, many years, looking after exactly this, which is government borrowing and interacting with the Reserve Bank for that. And this official said that, the RBI is wrong to say that they are committing their balance sheet to conduct of monetary policy. Actually, what they're doing, which may also be in some sense illegal, in fact, is that the Reserve Bank of India is facilitating government borrowing. They are managing a government borrowing program, trying to make it less costly for government to borrow. And another reason for saying this is that for all the liquidity measures that they have taken over the last 1.5 years, although the market was already in surplus, we haven't seen that much growth in credit. Just a few very high-rated corporates have increased their borrowing, and mainly it is government which is borrowing, whether state governments or central government. Is this in some way related to what you and I were just talking about, and how do all of these different strands that we have spoken about, how do they all come together and tell us if the RBI is heading in the right direction or not in terms of policy?
Yeah, so this relates to something that I said about the US earlier, which is that even in the US post 2007, the rate of growth of bank credit, for the period as a whole, let me put it this way, the path of bank credit over time is lower post 2007 compared to what it was before 2007. And it is because there is relatively less bank credit that the banks give the money to the Fed gives the money to the government. and the government spends. And why does the government spend? Because it says there is inadequate demand. The inadequate demand is because there is little investment, less investment. Now that story is playing out in India also. So here again, as you and I know, for a long time, the rate of growth of real investment in India also has been low. Okay, so related to that is also the bank credit growth. These two things are related. So when people talk about credit not expanding adequately, it is really real investment not expanding adequately. That is what is creating inadequacy in demand, which is what has to be filled in by the government. So the even in India, though to a lesser extent compared to the US, the banks are parking the money with the not all banks, but some, maybe many, are parking their funds with the RBI. The RBI is investing in government. So the government, sorry, the RBI buying government bonds is financed not just by the issue of currency. It is also financed by the money which the commercial banks or others are keeping with the RBI. So here too you have a similar story of the RBI acting as an intermediary between banks and the government. The banks are not investing in government bonds beyond a point, again because of the interest rate risk. Because the interest rates are very low at the moment in India. The nominal interest rates relative to our past, and of course with this inflation, the real rates are actually low. At one point of time, in one of my earlier columns, at that time it so happened that the real rate of interest in India was less than the real rate of interest in Germany, Japan, US. It's just that it is not visible here, and everybody talks about the negative interest rates in Germany. But coming back to this issue here, so the RBI also plays a financial intermediary role. So it's not entirely due to expansion of currency, which is inflationary. If it had been just that, then the inflation would have been even more. Does that have I missed part of your question, or?
No, so I was just saying that. So now we understand a lot of different RBI actions and the relationship between inflation and different RBI actions. I was just saying that how does all of this come together in terms of the corrective course for the RBI? What is it that they need to do now, in your view?
So I think the corrective measure at the RBI will have to begin with a corrective measure at the Government of India. So part of the difficulty, and to be fair to the RBI, they are having to do things given what the Government of India is doing. Okay. Now the Government of India is finding itself constrained. So what they feel is that the fiscal deficit has been high and it is difficult. Now, let me spend a moment on that part, which is again something many people don't appreciate. Many people point out that fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP is high in India, but it's not particularly alarming given the situation the world over. Okay. What they are missing out on is that the tax GDP ratio in India is much lower than the tax GDP ratio in the US or Europe or Japan, anywhere else. With the result that if you see fiscal deficit as a percentage of taxes or as a percentage of government expenditure, the situation is alarming in India. Now, this is a fact that the Government of India doesn't want to state openly, because Government of India bonds are supposed to be safe, sovereign bonds. If you make a statement like that, saying that our deficits are alarming, which will immediately have repercussions on government bonds, the sanctity of it, etc. So this is not a statement that any government can make. But it is important for us as economists to view this objectively. This is no criticism of the government. It is just the constraints under which they operate. So they can't go beyond a point in increasing the government expenditure. Now, given that they cannot expand government expenditure beyond a point, the burden falls on the RBI. And the RBI is having to keep the interest rates low, invest in government bonds and all the rest of it that we talked about. That's where the story ties up. Now, having said that the government is really facing a genuine constraint, let me also add a little more now to the government of India story, which is that even though the deficit is high, actually, in a broader sense of the term, the fiscal space is not very limited. Why am I saying that? Because there are three parts to this, the fiscal space. I have a separate piece on that at Ideas for India. But let me tell you the argument briefly here. So, one, the government of India anyway has a privatization program. Now they use the word privatization also. So they have that program. You can raise money through that. Second, the public land that the government has and the various public sector undertakings have is massive. There is a study which was done by Professor Subhashri Gangopadhyay for the Defense Ministry, if I recall correctly, a few years back, and that even showed some very large figures, not just for the quantity of land, but the amount of money that can be raised. Now, this is not the land where you need to change the land use. It is anyway not being used much. So that is a second source of revenue that you have. The third, though it's a little indirect, and I can explain how it can be handled to bring it in line with the other two parts that I've talked about. This is the foreign exchange reserves. The foreign exchange reserves, and now they are at $600 billion. And there's an interesting story there. When they were at $400 billion, and some of us said that these are high, they said no, these are not excessive. But they didn't say at what point they will become excessive. Okay. Then they became 450. Again they said no, these are not excessive. Again they didn't define when it will become excessive. 400, 450, 500, 550, 600 not be passed. And again the RBI has this to come to. These are not excessive. Now, when you look at it as in relation to the deficits, current account deficits, now, firstly, you should relate it to current account deficits. As Professor Kaushik Basu used to keep saying, people say, how many imports months does it cover? It is as if for those many months we will not be exporting at all. So you don't relate it to the months for which the imports will be covered. You relate it to the number of months for which the the current account deficits will be covered. And even that is under the assumption that we will have current account deficits without any capital inflow. And by the way, the two are related. We have flexible exchange rates. We are no longer under fixed exchange rates. So when you have a current account deficit, you have the capital inflow. So why should you even relate it to current account deficits when the capital flows are there anyway? Now, you should relate it to short-term capital flows or liquid. But even there, I saw the data for December 2020, the short-term debt or short-term funds, I don't remember exactly which one, that was 17% of the reserves then. That figure may be even lower now. Now, then there is this argument made that, our reserves are different from Chinese reserves because the Chinese reserves are a result of export surpluses. We have not had export surpluses. We've had deficits. So these reserves are not comparable to those. Yes, they are not comparable to those. We are an indebted nation. Okay, that debt is there. But that debt is capital inflows that are coming, suppose there are debt flows, for example, external commercial borrowing. So let's say Tata, some Tata company has borrowed abroad. Okay. Now that Tata company is indebted, but that Tata company is a solvent company. Corresponding to the debt, it has assets. Okay. So we as a nation have debt, and we as some corporates have debts, but we are solvent. Okay. If we are solvent, that's not an issue. So we are. So let us not talk in terms of these reserves being different because we have not incurred surpluses. Now, would you keep such large borrowings in the form of liquid assets? Now, what does a Tata company do? It would invest in long-term assets. It would not keep it liquid. It would arrange for liquidity when the time for repayment comes. Similarly, for the other companies as well. Now, for a nation as a whole, of course, the RBI has the responsibility, and it will need to take care of these aspects. But how far? Not 600 billion. We are a poor nation. What is happening is that the RBI is lending to the government of US at low rates of interest.
For extremely low rates of interest.
Extremely low rates of interest. So now let me get back to the original point. The original point was that when you consider the public sector undertakings, which are anyway to be privatized, when you consider the excess public land and when you consider the excess reserves, forex reserves held with the RBI as a public authority, then the three give you a lot of fiscal space. Now, in normal circumstances, you borrow because you are in this kind of a situation. But given that the deficit to taxes ratio is very high, extremely high, the debt to taxes ratio is extremely high. Under that situation, there is another route. In fact, that route is not available to the US. That route is not available to Europe. That route is available to us thanks to the fact that we have had excess public land, we have excess foreign exchange reserves, we have these public sector undertakings. Now, I'm not saying privatization for this purpose, but if you do have anyway a program of privatization, then do that. Now, I'll add another argument. There is talk of the stock market prices being on the higher side. Even if one doesn't want to use the word bubble, they are somewhat on the higher side, let's say. Now, one thing that the central bank and the government of India want to do is to have financial stability. Okay. So it's in fact a good time to privatize. You will offload shares, the government of India will get good money, and the supply of shares will increase. You will you will stabilize the stock market as well. So, it's serving several different purposes. I have more to say, but I have gone on. If you want to ask another question.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Okay. So firstly, the government of India can spend more by these means. Now, the other thing is that supposing for some reason you say that no, we are not going to borrow and we are not going to sell these. Okay. Then does it mean that you do nothing? No. And that is something that I would like to emphasize strongly on, because there is an issue of poverty, there is an issue of unemployment, there is an issue of COVID-19, there is a health issue, there are humanitarian concerns. People are suffering. They have been suffering. Now, firstly, as I said, all these could be helped and it doesn't require too much money. It could be raised through the sources that I mentioned without running into an issue of fiscal crisis now or at a later stage, without risking that or risking the ratings from the foreign agencies. But then what can you do? Well, we don't have just Keynesian fiscal policy. We have reallocated fiscal policy. It's just a matter of spending less on something and spending more on other things. So even if you are a fiscal hawk and you say that no, I'm not going to spend additional, don't spend additional if you must stick to that line of reasoning. That doesn't stop you from paying a poor person, from supplying oxygen to some hospital. And by the way, some of these things, sure, it's not just a question of money. You have to have a domestic availability. Now, when the domestic availability is not there, you have trade. What is trade for? And by the way, it is in no contradiction to the idea of Atmanirbharta. You can very well import in an emergency situation. So, and how do you import? Well, come back to 600 billion of reserves. 600 billion. If you do a calculation on the amount that is needed for oxygen, ICUs, makeshift hospitals, vaccines, all together, it comes to a very, very small percentage of 600 billion. We are not a poor nation in that sense at all. So there are ways of handling any of these issues.
What I was saying, and this is my last point to you, is that so it seems to me that for people who understand the technicalities of all of what we've been talking about, monetary policy, fiscal policy, um, there are a lot of solutions available, and the situation may not be as dire as sometimes people believe. But because probably good decisions are not getting taken, especially at the end of the government, good choices are not being made, and we don't know whether this is because of lack of technical inputs or because of political ideological reasons. Or just general low capacity in government, whatever be the reason, but because not good decision making is taking place, not good policy choices are being made, therefore the situation is shaping up the way it is, and the way it is shaping up, we may be creating bigger problems. So
Well,
something needs to be done. And at one point, with relation to the fiscal situation, you said that the levels of the deficits are now alarming. Fiscal deficit has been high for a long period of time, in fact. So that the situation does not become get out of hand, what would you like to say to people who are in a position to make these corrections?
so before I say something to people who are making decisions, let me say something to the people who are opposing these decisions. That is also important. Now, there is this sharp division between fiscal doves, fiscal hawks, inflation doves, inflation hawks, and that left and right. Now these divisions don't help. These classifications don't help. So the first thing, in fact, I would like to say to the critiques of the government, and my message to them is that you are looking at it from one viewpoint, and you're not appreciating the government's viewpoint. And it doesn't help to say that the government is acting in a foolish manner. That is not the correct approach. There are some things that the government and the RBI are not in a position to state publicly. So one does need to appreciate, when you have a different point of view, then something which is very correct from one point of view looks absurd from another point of view. Give some benefit of doubt and say, well, let me try to understand why is it that they're doing. Having said that, I'm not saying that the government of India or the RBI are doing everything right, particularly on fiscal space, because that is where that in fact many things. For me, the Gangotri comes back there. That if you were to expand and use that fiscal space, and we are fortunate in a sense there, then they can spend more. They need not even rely much more on reallocated fiscal policy. And when they spend more, they can also ease the burden on RBI. We can also ease the burden on inflation, on the inflation tax, etc. So that is where I relate a lot of things to. Now, if you use that fiscal space and spend more, that takes care of the critique that other people have. that the government should be spending more. Yes, the government should be spending more, but please suggest a way out carefully. Don't just say spend, spend, spend. It has to be a little more meaningful, a little more substantial than that.
Thank you, Professor Singh, for bringing this nuance to the whole debate that we are seeing on both fiscal policy and monetary policy, and how the two are related. I think this nuance is being completely missing, and as you say, there is need for the two sides to talk to each other a little more, understand each other's point of view and starting points a little more, and then look at these nuances that you've brought out. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Pooja. That was really nice.